Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is actually my first visit to Ireland. It's also thanks to Laura Burke and her team at EPA for organizing this conference and inviting me here. I don't have a team to write a 17-page speech, but I have a number of illustrations, and I'll try to be brief and maybe skip a few things that the previous speakers already mentioned. I mean, most of you probably know what the European Environment Agency is or what we're doing. And of course, Laura has a very close relationship sitting on the management board, and also she's been the chair for a couple of years. But very broadly, we're an agency of the European Union. We are independent in the sense that we're not receiving instructions or so from the Commission or the other players. We're supporting building and implementation and monitoring of EU environmental and climate policies, very broadly. And we were actually the only agency founded together with a network, so we are very much a network organization, the EINet, where of course here the EPA is a part of it. I have my secret tool here. Good. I'm working in the group on climate change risks and adaptation. And of course, I'm focusing on the European climate risk assessment. However, just to mention that, of course, we're doing many more things. We recently published a report on urban adaptation, and just today, colleagues are launching a report on climate change risks to human health. Also, we are running the platform Climate Adapt, which is constantly being extended, evaluated, and with new sections being added. Now, the European Climate Risk Assessment, where does it, what's the background of it? Basically, it was announced in the EU Adaptation Strategy 3 years ago, where the Commission promised to draw up such an assessment. And a bit later, like a year later, they actually came to us and asked us whether we could lead that. Also, there has been a call later by the European Parliament after another summer of record climate events 2022 to urgently draw up such a comprehensive risk assessment. So I think it's fair to say there's a clear call and interest both from policymakers but also from the wider public in Europe. So the first European Climate Risk Assessment responds to those requests from policymakers and society at large. I think it's important to emphasize in this context, and I understand that you may be in a similar situation here in Ireland. This is the first assessment. It's a fast-track assessment. We had about 1.5 years, and so we definitely needed to make some strategic choices and cut some corners, and I'll come back to this very soon. We emphasized from the very beginning to have a wide stakeholder involvement. So we were working very closely, in particular, with Commission departments. In this round, not quite as strongly with the member states. We didn't have the time to do that. Maybe that's something to reflect for the next one. And the focus was to identify the major risks, the most urgent risks for the next EU policy cycle. And of course, you're aware of the upcoming elections next month. Yeah, just a few things, what to expect and where there are also some limitations in this first assessment, is that this was a fast-track assessment, and still we were able to add a number of innovative elements compared to earlier reports and assessments, including those from the IPCC, which of course is a great and important basis, those from the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, who kindly enough provided a lot of expertise and also co-authors, but also our own reports. A number of aspects had to be excluded, including, for instance, where we were not able to look at national adaptation policies and actions here. Yeah, I think this is really kind of the headline message. EUCRA is a wake-up call. Not the first one, probably not the last one, but it's the first systematic wake-up call at the European level, where EU body did a relatively comprehensive risk assessment. And I don't need to repeat things about Europe being the fastest warming continent and so on. But yeah, as other speakers said before, climate risks are threatening ecosystems, water resources, food and energy security, infrastructure, financial stability. I'm sure we'll hear about this later after the coffee break, and people's health. So it's not just environment policy. Adaptation to climate change is good economic policy, good social policy, good health policy. So we do need this all-government approach here. It has been mentioned a number of times before this morning that we have left any, let's say, historical climate. This is the fever curve of the Earth. This is the global temperature curve. And if you just look at the red and yellow lines, this is the last year. And for a year now, each month has broken the all-time temperature record at a global level, but we see it similarly in Europe. Last year was the warmest year on record by a huge margin, and almost certainly the warmest year in the last 100,000 years. So the Earth's climate is already far outside its natural range. Europe is warming much faster than the global average. Interestingly enough, if you look, I'm sure you've located Ireland here, being the only blue country in a way in Europe. It doesn't mean that Ireland is cooling, but due to its maritime climate, the heat has not quite hit Ireland as strongly as other parts. If I understand correctly, Ireland still enjoys a relatively cool maximum all-time temperature of 33 degrees, whereas your neighbors to the east, the UK, already broke the 40 degrees target, something I would not have imagined when I was younger than now. And in Southern Europe, we've even reached 48, 49 degrees. So climate change is affecting all parts of the world, also all parts of Europe, but of course in a differential manner. While large parts of Southern Europe are suffering droughts, I understand that you have made different experience in the last couple of months in particular. So this is just a short overview showing how different regions in Europe are affected differently, and obviously rain patterns here we see in particular a north-south patterns. So in UCRA, in this UCRA, we present our climate risk assessment in two formats. The first one is what we call thematic fact sheets. This is more, let's say, traditional risk assessment as much as possible in a quantitative or semi-quantitative manner for sectors and systems. I don't need to repeat them here. I mean, we had to, once again, make strategic choices. So we're focusing on those kind of risks which could present major challenges at the European level. So we're not doing every risk everywhere. So for instance, you will not see tourism as a sector here. Yes, we have risks for tourism there or other things, but we're not doing a classical sectoral approach. We needed to focus on where Europe could be particularly challenged. The second format are the risk storylines. And here we look in a bit more detail at complex climate risks. Complex could mean cascading hazards. It could mean risks that cascade, compound hazards, risks that cascade from one sector to another, from one region to another, complex combinations of climatic and non-climatic risk drivers. They are often very important, maybe even more important than some of the more narrow risks. At the same time, they're harder to quantify, so it's a bit harder to apply a more standard risk assessment framework here. So this is our summary graph here. The pie charts, they represent 36 major climate risks that we identified in the process, major climate risks for Europe, which were grouped into 5 broad clusters: ecosystems, food, health, infrastructure, including the built environment, and economy and finance. And the color of the pies shows the urgency of action needed according to 5 categories, and the width of the pie shows the number of risks in each of those clusters. Maybe it's important to emphasize that almost all of the selected major risks can reach critical or even catastrophic levels during this century, in particular under a high warming scenario. So of course, even though I will not emphasize it further, climate mitigation remains a central need to keep risks somewhat manageable. More than half of the risks, 21 to be specific, need more action now, with 8 of them being particularly urgent. These are the purple ones. And you will also see that urgent action is needed for risks from all 5 policy clusters, indicating that policies need to increase in ambition, scope, and implementation. I'll now give a very brief overview of some of those risks, but please have a look at the report if you're interested further. So climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation in Europe, but the risks to those ecosystems generally result from a combination of climate change and other anthropogenic drivers, being it pollution, eutrophication, unsustainable land use, overfishing, etc. Risks to coastal and marine ecosystems are the most severe in the current period and entail the highest urgency to act. Once again, here we see a combination of climatic and non-climatic drivers. Forests are also particularly at risk, and they have difficulties in adapting to the longevity of tree species. I'm just highlighting a few of those risks here. These are also the short names of the risks. More information is available in the main report. Food, important of course for all of us. Europe faces multiple challenges to food production and food security, so here we try to look at both aspects. Of course, the production is important, and here we already see that crop production is facing substantial climate risks in Europe as a whole, and critical risk levels in southern Europe. Of course, here heat and drought are the main challenges. And I will not highlight northern or northwestern Europe here in this overview presentation, not to say that there is no action needed here, but we asked our experts to identify those regions which are, let's say, at particularly high risk, and in a number of cases, indeed, southern Europe was the hotspot region, but it doesn't imply that the rest of Europe can lay back, quite obviously. In addition to the production risk, food and nutrition security in Europe faces risk also from production risk abroad. So, of course, we are relying, some countries more than others, on food imports, on feed imports from outside Europe, and of course, many of the source regions are also facing climate risks, maybe even stronger than here. Next cluster, human health. It's clear that climate change poses major risks to human health systems. And in Europe, in the summer of 2022, we again saw around 70,000 premature deaths due to extreme heat. Once again, in this case, at least Ireland is kind of a lucky island. You didn't have those highly deadly heat waves so far. You're faced with other challenges here. So these risks are already reaching critical levels in southern Europe, and some regions and some population groups are affected more than others. So it's the elderly, the outdoor workers, and others who are particularly affected here. Also, looking at the European pictures, wildfires are a major risk to human health, but of course also to infrastructure, ecosystems, carbon sequestration, and so on. Also, climate change can increase transmission risk for various infectious diseases, and a number of diseases that I learned as tropical diseases when I was a bit younger are now no longer tropical diseases. They're established in Europe, being the West Nile virus and a number of others. Next cluster is infrastructure and built environment. Here, basically every part of Europe is affected. Extreme weather events are posing increasing risk to the built environment in Europe, as well as the services they provide, because they can disrupt essential services such as energy supply, water supply, and transport networks. You'll see pluvial and fluvial flooding here as the highest priority risk in terms of the urgency to act. And maybe just one explanation on the methodology, which is interesting here. Of course, coastal floods, if you look at the graph or at the table, present even higher risks without additional action in the long term, because sea level rise is accelerating, and at many of the beautiful cities in Europe, including Dublin, are close to the coast. But for coastal floods, we also see over the last 60 years, we didn't have really catastrophic floods in Europe. We learned how to deal with those floods after some catastrophes in the 50s and 60s. So even though the risk level in the long term is higher, the urgency is assessed, urgency of action is assessed one category lower here, considering that we're better prepared to deal with them than with inland floods, where we also had in my home country, Germany, quite drastic experiences in recent years. I will not go through the details here. I'd rather like to come to the conclusions and leave some time for discussion. The last point, and maybe also interesting in terms of the discussion after the coffee break, is we try to understand what those more sectoral impacts mean economy-wide and for the financial system. And we consider the European macro fiscal and financial system to be at substantial risk from the impacts of climate change, both within Europe and abroad. Serious sector and regional specific risks could catalyze a systemic financial shock, and also the public finances of EU member states face substantial risks from climate change, even in the near term. Maybe just two examples. The 2021 floods in parts of Western Germany and neighboring countries, they caused damages of more than 40 billion euros in just Germany. Maybe Germany can kind of deal with it, but if those damages had occurred in a smaller country, that could be catastrophic. Slovenia then last year experienced a flood with reconstruction costs estimated at 10 billion euros. That's 1/6, 16% of the national GDP. So it's clear that this cannot be done without increasing general taxes and so on, and other countries might face difficulties accessing the financial market. So these are not peanuts, in particular for smaller countries. And also we increasingly see difficulties of getting insurance for natural hazards. In the EU outermost regions, so outside, let's say, the geographical Europe, mainland Europe, there are already regions which no longer can be insured. We also see this in parts of the US and so on. But this is also an increasing risk, and of course with social implications if you cannot access flood insurance or fire insurance any longer. So what are a number of key takeaways from this? Several major climate risks have already reached critical levels. I have to say, in particular in Southern Europe, even more than in other regions. Almost all major climate risks could reach critical or catastrophic levels during this century under a high warming scenario, and without strong adaptation mitigation, hundreds of thousands of people could die from heat waves, and economic losses from coastal floods alone in a high warming scenario could exceed €1 trillion per year. Societal preparedness is lacking the fast increase in major climate risks. A lot of actions are happening at the European level, at the national level. We heard great examples just before, but the increase in risks requires more and urgent action here. And apologies for this slide. We have not been managed so far to convey this graphic in a way that is suitable for a presentation. So let me just say, on the left side, in the left column, you see the 36 major risks identified. And And on the right side, you see EU policy areas, and in particular those where the European level has something to say. And then we linked those risks with the policy areas to see which policy areas are actually exposed. And of course, it's the usual suspects. It's agriculture, it's ecosystems, biodiversity protection, it's health. But it's also industry, it's also trade, it's also other areas. So it's really a cross-cutting issues that requires collaboration and a one government approach here. And once again, this is focusing at European level, but of course, Europe is made of countries, of regions, of cities, of citizens, so it's also relevant here. It's clear that we must act now to increase our resilience now and in the future. Many adaptation policies and measures require quite a bit of long-term planning or current decisions on which forests to plant or which type of buildings to build or where to situate infrastructure have long-term consequences. And we must prevent locking ourselves into pathways that are not fit for the future in a changing climate. Maybe land use, long-lived infrastructure, forestry are just some of the examples. Also, as mentioned before, climate adaptation doesn't happen in a policy vacuum. It needs to consider multiple policy objectives together to avoid maladaptation and to focus on synergies wherever they are available. Because adaptation policies can both support and conflict with other environmental, social, or economic policy objectives. Something I didn't go into much detail in this presentation is that we also looked in a broad way on who is actually the risk owner, who is in the best position to address those risks. And of course, you can take a legalistic perspective here, look at the treaties making up the European Union, which is of course central. But we also looked at the risk perspective. I mean, many climate risks don't know borders, such as for marine ecosystems. And it turns out that for most of the risks, basically, they are co-owned by the EU and by the national level. We didn't go further into subnational or the role of the private sector here. But I think a key take-home message is we need to cooperate between the European and the national level. And yeah, over my career at the EEA, I've also seen an increasing willingness to accept that when I started, some countries, including my own home country, they were maybe a bit defensive and said, no, adaptation is local, you please do your thing. I think we've seen an attitude changing here to sense that everyone has a role, and I hope this assessment can inform such a discussion of what is the appropriate level to do at European, at national, at subnational level. But, of course, with a message to our partners at the EU level, it's clear that stronger EU policy action is urgently needed in a number of areas to manage those major climate risks. That was it. Still within time. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm very happy to be here.
Invite Laura and Una as well to join us up on the stage for what will be actually a short enough Q&A. We're just a little bit behind on time, but important to have the opportunity to ask questions from the floor and from online. So does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? And actually, I'll take a few rather than just going one at a time. So there's a question here in the middle.
Thank you very much. Raoul Lampi from Sustaneo. Interested in one particular risk, because to me this is all about risk management. So James Lovelock visited Dublin a number of years ago, and he said, Ireland could be potentially the lifeboat for humanity. I see these risk assessments have tourism, but what about migrants? So you might just maybe answer, maybe we're not addressing that because it could be a political hot potato, but I'm interested. To me, it seems like a very big risk, migrants and defence.
There's a question here from Frank Humphrey. take 3 and then open it up.
Do I need a mic or?
I can hear you.
Shout, Frank.
Thanks. Frank Convery, thanks very much. Hans-Martin, I'm curious about to me, when I look at the EU level, it seems to me that the single market and the insurance market within that is hugely significant, because it's all about risk management, obviously, and the effectiveness of the insurance system in Europe in terms of spreading the risk and the portfolio and so on is, to me anyway, seems to be an obvious entry point for payoff to effort at EU level. And in Ireland, the insurance market doesn't work very well, really, for many different areas of the financial system and so on. So I'd be interested in your reflection on that. In terms of the EU intervention, the array is almost infinite and in terms of priorities, to me, insurance seems to be one big opportunity. And I suppose for Una and Laura, the priorities for Ireland, we tend to end up with 160 measures to act on, blah, blah, blah. But the system can usually only do about 3. And the question is, what has to happen to be effective? Thank you.
Okay, just one more then, and we can open it up. There's good diversity there so far. There's one question here at the back.
Yeah, just a comment to make, and then the question, but I think I might have been already asked. I was informed previously that for every 6 degrees of temperature increase, that the volume of water increases by 5 meters. So when you say the EU has 1.5 as the average global temperature, and the EU is twice that, that would mean that it's 3 degrees. Or if you're saying it's 40 degrees somewhere down in the south, that would mean that this would be 3 meters higher in the Mediterranean Sea, thus rising up the rainfall as it rises up from the sun and causes all those floods. That's the comment. But the other one was, you're saying you have 4,000 policy directives to do in the next 5 years. So I take it that that would be 2 a day. And we're now 6 months in, so that's 300 done, 4,700 to do. Whatever about Ireland, the rest of Europe must be the same, if not more, and they must have done the same. And as the man said, nobody in their right mind would do more than 2 changes a year, at max. So, and human beings themselves won't do it for 10 years. So what are your chances?
Okay. Great. They're good spread there. You can go anywhere on this. Who wants to kick it off?
Okay, is the microphone on?
Yeah.
The first question was on security risks, international risks, migration. This is indeed one of the areas, I didn't mention it specifically, that we excluded in the first European climate risk assessment, partly because being a European Environment Agency and with our network, we didn't have specific expertise there. That was one reason. Also, there has been significant work done by JRC. In the meantime, there has been a joint declaration between the EU and NATO on those risks. So we felt there were a number of organizations in a better position than we to provide that perspective. And also in terms of migration, it's, I would say, ethically problematic to see this only as a risk. Yes, of course, migration can be a political risk depending on who comes under what conditions, also an economic risk, but it can also be opportunities. And so within this risk framework for the first assessment, we said from the beginning we're excluding some of the international risk. We focus on supply chains. That would be discussed for the second one. Then there was a question regarding the insurance framework, and I agree this is something extremely important. Insurance can be part of a solution for some of the climate risks, but can also exaggerate problems. And I remember a number of years ago when we when the European Commission organized a discussion with many high-level stakeholders from the insurance and saying, these are the climate change scenarios, are you worried? And CEOs, or no, sorry, not CEOs, but senior managers of reinsurance companies said, not really, we renew our contracts on an annual basis, so we just either adjust the rates or withdraw coverage. I mean, that might be interesting from an insurance perspective, but it's not a particularly welcome solution if you're taking out insurance and realize you can no longer afford it. So I think that's the perspective we bring. It's not just about the industry, it's also about those served by the industry. And of course, there are different solutions in countries. Some have a strong role of the government, some have a stronger role of the private sector here. But this is indeed an increasing risk. And if we look at, let's say, Florida or so, where large regions can no longer get coverage, this should be a warning sign also for Europe. And the third one was on specific climate aspects. I think we have a number of presentations this afternoon or later this morning on the specific situation in Europe. Just to say that sea level rise is largely global. So for that, it doesn't matter so much whether one part of Europe is warming further than the other. So this is largely a global phenomenon, including some gravitational effects if the Greenland ice sheet is melting faster than others, but I won't go into that.
Okay, all right.
I might, so I might pick up just on the migration point, I suppose particularly from an Irish context, but also from an international one. And I'm actually speaking here a little bit about my knowledge from my last job, but one, when I was responsible for migration in the Department of Justice. So migration caused by climate change is merely one of the factors that causes people to migrate across the world. Economic factors, obviously, are a huge part of it, and as we're discovering at the moment, or as the political suggestion is, that there can be quite localized factors as well. I would say that all government planning has factored in climate change as a potential for an aspect of causing people in search of a better future for themselves and their children to need to migrate, just as Irish people have migrated for many generations. That being said, the key aspect for us is, because Ireland cannot be the lifeboat for the world, which I think is what the questioner suggested, at best we would be an ark. So we need to work with across the global south to make sure that they too can adapt to climate change. And it's actually really critically important that they get the chance to do that, both to mitigate their own aspects, but to adapt. And it's almost more important for them, because Ireland, yes, will be affected by climate change, absolutely. But there are parts of the global south who may well no longer have a home at the end of this process. So it's critically important that we do that. And I just want to flag some of the work that Minister Ryan has been doing in an international context, in the context of COP and so forth. Probably something you don't think about or read about, but he's been working very hard on international methodologies of financing this work, because one of the key issues for trying to get investment into the global south is that they don't tend to have good access to international sources of finance. So it's important that, and the Minister Ryan has been very strong on this, is working very hard on this. And I should say, for all of his reputation at home, he is very well regarded abroad on this, and indeed in Europe. He's working very hard in trying to ensure that we can leverage private investment sources as well as public investment sources to try and drive adaptation change in the global south. And I think for all of us in Ireland, we need to be supportive of those endeavours, because, as you've quite rightly pointed out, Hans-Martin, there's an ethical aspect to this as well. It's really, really important that our fellow human beings across the world are able to adapt to climate change as quickly as possible, just as we need to adapt. So, and we share these problems. And one way in which we may share them is through increased migration. So it's important that we need to build that into our thinking about this process as well.
Great. Thanks, Una. And Laura, do you want to come in on the priorities or any other aspect of what was raised?
Mainly focus on the priorities, and I think it's a really, really good question from Frank, because if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. And I think the adaptation framework, or the adaptation risk assessment that we're doing is going to be absolutely critical, because actually identifying what are the different risks is, and kind of on a standardized basis is key. But on the face of it, I would say we should be looking for win-wins. So where's the opportunity in the context of adaptation and delivering on other aspects? The just resilience is part of that, because we're already seeing industries that no longer exist because of climate change. You know, you look at the Midlands and Ireland, the peat industry is an industry that employed an awful lot of people, no longer does. So where are the opportunities that also look after the people? And a lot of the adaptation is all about the people. Two sectors, Frank, I would say, is the agriculture sector. It's such a critical sector for Ireland. We're already seeing, we tend in Ireland to focus on the emissions from agriculture and that challenge. It's equally how agriculture is impacted by a changing climate, and already we're seeing that this year with, for example, tillage. You know, farmers not able to be growing crops at the same time as previous years. So how are we going to adapt in the context of agriculture? How are we going to diversify? How are we going to build resilience into the system? That's going to be absolutely critical. There is also an opportunity there when you're talking about migration, etc., that expertise built in one country can also be shared then with other countries. The other sector that I would talk about is infrastructure. We've got creaking infrastructure anyway. We know that in Ireland. We've significant challenges. Over the last number of years, there's been a lot of investment, for example, in wastewater, drinking water infrastructure. Also, energy infrastructure is a priority here. So in the context of addressing our infrastructural issues, we need to take into consideration adaptation as part of that. So those would be the kind of the overall areas that I would talk about, but we'll have more knowledge next year when we've done the risk assessment. Maybe very briefly on the migration issue, because I think, you know, Hans-Martin highlighted and Una really well. This can be seen as a negative, and actually Ireland has a history of, you know, our people are all over the world, and we're very, very proud of that. So we should be cognizant of it. There has been research that says in the context of climate, and sometimes I think it's been portrayed as a very negative thing in the context of climate change. There has also been research that has been done that in the context of climate change, people tend to move within countries rather than from country to country. But in a way, that's not relevant. There's a bigger piece to this about what role we should play, and looking at the opportunities as well as the risks.
Brilliant. Look, thanks very much. I would love to do another round of questions, but I think I'm conscious of coffee, and I have a note here that says we're restarting at 11:30. So we're going to have to wrap up this session and say thank you to our speakers who've taken time out of their really busy schedules to really set up the conference today. And so a round of applause for our speakers, and over to coffee.